Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is changing times in real estate. We thank our special guest, Scott Rechler, Chairman and CEO of RXR, Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh, Professor of Real Estate, Columbia Business School, and Larry Suskind, Professor of Urban and Environmental Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. There was a very big number at the top of a page in the New York Times business section a few days ago. The big number was 49%. According to the Times story below it, that is the average office occupancy rate compared with pandemic levels in pre-pandemic levels in major American cities, 49%. The Times writer contrasted office work with air travel. That's bounced back. But for now, at least, it appears that the pandemic-driven move to working from home is still popular, certainly with workers who are spending part of each week working but not commuting. As demand for office space diminishes because of working from home, but also because of layoffs in some sectors of the economy, the value of office buildings diminishes. And as the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to try to tame inflation, the owners of office buildings face higher costs when they refinance. Where are we headed if commercial real estate, which provides many cities with important sources of revenue, where are we headed if there's insufficient income to pay the rising costs of operating big office buildings? Is there a crisis coming? And does the prospect of that just threaten landlords and bankers, or are the rest of us exposed to its consequences? Big questions for which we have three very experienced panelists: a real estate executive, a professor of real estate, and an urban planner whose specialty is complicated multi-party negotiations. Our first panelist is Scott Rechler, who has joined us before to talk about real estate in the post-pandemic world. I guess the pandemic was underway that time. Mr. Rechler is CEO and chairman of RXR. His company, based in New York City, owns dozens of buildings, commercial, residential, industrial, mostly in and around New York. Scott Rechler has been vice chair of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, chair of the Regional Plan Association, and a board member of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. He now sits on the New York Federal Reserve Board, and I should acknowledge that he's been very active in the organization that sponsors Global Connections, the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Scott Rechler, welcome back.
Robert, good to be here.
A couple of years ago, the future for your industry and your city looked a lot brighter. This year, your firm's white paper described the current situation, and I quote, as not a minor obstacle that must be circumvented, but more a chasm every sector of our economy must cross. How bad is it?
Yeah, so, I think coming out of COVID, we knew that the world post-COVID was going to be different than the world prior to COVID. And, we would speak, and the language that we would say was there was the new abnormal during COVID, and we were transitioning to whatever that new normal would be. And I think what this past year has shown is that that path to the new normal is more turbulent than anticipated. And we've seen that, whether that's the spike in inflation, the excess of liquidity that's been in the marketplace, the situation where you've seen growth that took place, whether it's technology companies or retail companies or people taking office space, assuming a level of demand that existed during the COVID period that they assumed was sustainable, that wasn't sustainable, that's got to be brought back. And so you have a number of these challenges that have been playing itself through. One of which you referenced in the opening comments was sort of the future of the office space and thinking about bringing people back to the office and remote work versus hybrid work. And I will say, to that point, I'm more confident that we have better clarity now. And I think that at least in the major cities like New York, that we have seen a recognition that there's going to be hybrid work, and that's something we anticipated. I always would say the genie's out of the bottle. You could see the benefit of technology, that when people come back to the workplace, it's going to be providing also flexibility. So when they come back, they don't have these long commutes, but when they do come back, it's also going to be a different experience. Going to be about leaning into engagement, leaning into collaboration with your peers, apprenticeship, mentorship. And so what that workspace looks like needs to be different. And so we're in our buildings and, seeing a higher level of return to the office, at least, I would say Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays, maybe in some cases, Mondays, Fridays, I'm not sure is going to be salvageable for many, but so we're situating around that new normal right now.
I want you to describe the impact on various properties. Your company looked at the current situation of RXR properties and ran them through a review that was you called Project Kodak, named for perhaps the worst business decision in our lifetimes, which was when the giant in photography, Kodak, took a pass on digital photography and didn't think it was serious. You went through properties trying to say, is this when film, I mean, a goner with a past but no future, or is this when digital, a building that has a future? How do you decide that? What determines whether a building is film or a building is digital?
Right, and to your point, and part of the reason for calling it Project Kodak was we wanted to be eyes wide open and face the reality, right, and try to be very intentional about determining which of the properties that we think will be the most competitive in the post-COVID world and which ones would have a hard time being competitive. And the best analogy I can give is what happened with e-commerce, right? When e-commerce happened, people would shop online and people began to say, why am I going to go to that mall again? And people began to write off malls. And what you started to see was that malls that were well located, that had good entertainment, that had good ownership, were able to actually become places that were destinations that people went for outings, and they ended up doing well. Malls that were further away, that were more commodity-like, were just sort of tired, they became competitively obsolete. And it took, a number of years to create the distinction between the two. And the same is happening with office, right? Which is the buildings that will be competitive are the ones that are easy to get to, right? The easy commute, that are in neighborhoods that are energizing, that have good restaurants, good activity, a good sense of community, that the buildings themselves have good infrastructure, outdoor space, amenities, programming. And so you have to go carefully through your portfolio to say which ones of those buildings can compete. The ones that can't compete are ones that are not going to be something that there's even a rental number that you can ultimately lease it for office. So you have to think of what's the alternative use for that building, if there is a viable alternative use.
But it sounds like it was a brutal process. I mean, one of the buildings that you own, 61 Broadway, was very public when you more or less announced that. I don't know if you announced that it was film, not digital, but you announced that you weren't paying anymore, and you can do that under the contract you have. You weren't paying the loan on it anymore. And I can look at the advertising for that building online still, and it says, it has the three virtues of real estate: location, location, and location. What is it that makes a seemingly attractive building in today's environment a property not worth pursuing?
Yeah, so it's that building. It's an older pre-war building in Lower Manhattan. It's not one of the newer buildings by the World Trade Center where the transportation hub is really more active. Smaller floor plates, smaller size the tenants that occupy that building, and so and to your point, when we went through the process of Project Kodak, we were pretty public about it, and we did that so that we could communicate to our stakeholders and our tenants that this is not just RXR, this is where the world is today, right? And we're going to be focused on adjusting, because this is not just a real estate problem, as you noted, right? This is, in my opinion, this is a problem for the urban ecosystem in which we operate, because if you have buildings that sit vacant, that were once assets that created vibrancy, created tax revenue, supported the local businesses, supported the local restaurants in these submarkets within our urban environments, if they sit vacant, they become liabilities. They become places where people loiter. They don't provide tax revenue. They're not supporting the local businesses, and so that can have a devastating effect on our urban ecosystem, and something that we need to be proactively trying to address.
Just one other point: when you or any other property owner in say downtown Manhattan or in any other downtown in America, when you decide that it's no longer worth paying the financing on the building, that's a loan that the bank has to at some point acknowledge and write off. So we're talking about a potential real estate crisis here, but it sounds like we're also talking about a banking crisis.
Yep. I think just to be clear, we're experiencing two things right now, right? One is we're experiencing a paradigm change to sort of a new regime of where interest rates were, which was near zero or at zero for over a decade and a half, to now where they become more normalized. And I'm not just talking the short-term rates, I'm just saying more generally. Everything that was valued in the and capital structures that were put in place in that old low interest rate regime needs to be reevaluated today and have a new capital structure for this new regime. And this was like very similar to the early 90s, late 80s, when we had the savings and loan crisis. In that case, it was tax driven, inflated real estate values, and then tax policy changed, and that caused a problem. On top of that, we have more of the existential challenge of the future of the workplace, right? So office buildings have a double hit. But to your point, it's not just office buildings, it's multifamily, it's industrial buildings. Any building across the country that has had this problem now needs to be addressed, and it will impact banks, because particularly regional banks, because they make up about 70% of the commercial real estate loans, and when you think about local borrowers, and they tended to go to those regional banks for those loans, and now as those loans have to be remarked to the current value to reflect where the interest rates are today. Many of them are underwater. I mean, I've heard numbers as high as 50% of the banks that are, I'll call the small to medium sized banks, if you marked their fixed income, their bonds and their real estate holdings to market at this point, they would be underwater right now, those banks, right there, and their balance sheets. So I think we're going to have a shakeout. That's going to be a multi-year shakeout on the banking system as real estate loans come due and have to work to be refinanced. That's going to result into having much fewer banks around the country. Right now, there's over 4,700 banks. I could see there being 500 to 1,000 less banks in the U.S. Within the next couple of years.
Well, Scott Rechler, stick with us, because in a few minutes we're going to have our Q&A and discussion portion, but thank you very much for now. We're going to turn now to our second panelist. He actually studies the business that Scott Rechler works in. Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh is a professor of real estate at Columbia Business School. He has studied not just the impact of higher interest rates and working from home on real estate values. He's also made a rigorous examination of an interesting idea that's sort of making lemonade from lemons when the lemons are empty office buildings. The idea is converting office buildings to apartment houses. We'll hear about that and other matters from Professor Van Neiuwerburgh. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Robert. Great to be with you.
There you are. First, I want you to try to sort out, you've looked at this rigorously, the causes of loss of value in real estate. That is, if some of it is caused by rising real estate, some of it's caused by tenants who need less office space, how do you analyze the loss of value?
Yeah, so I think Scott laid it out very nicely for us, where there's basically a secular change, and then there's which is a remote work change. And then there's the interest rate environment, which has dramatically changed as well. So one way to look at it is, just the rise in interest rates that we've experienced in the last couple of years, takes out, for a typical office building in New York City, maybe about 30% of the value just off the bat, even without any headwinds from reduced demand from remote work. Mm-hmm. Now layer on top of that, this secular change in remote work, which has depressed office demand, and which has already shown up in cash flows that office owners are earning, and you get sort of an additional maybe 20 to 30% drop in value. So according to my estimates, a Class B office building, a lower quality, older office building in New York City, probably today, sort of on a mark-to-market basis, if we were to revalue it, would be worth about up to 60% less than it was just a few short years ago.
Let me just repeat that for a second. You wrote this to a property that had a pre-pandemic valuation of $100 million is presently valued at $38.9 million after all those forces are taken into account.
That's right. And that's an older building. That's a Class B building. I think the situation is not as dramatic for the best part of the market, the A+ segment of the market that maybe loses only 20% in value. It's of course also affected by these higher interest rates. But there's a flight to quality happening in the office market as well, where some of the most amenitized buildings that are able to attract the most deep-pocketed tenants are able to charge high rents and find tenants in the first place. So there's sort of a bifurcation in the market happening. It's that lower quality office product that is really severely hit.
I'm asking a lot about New York City in part. You're in New York. Scott Rechler's properties, mostly are in New York. How well does New York City stand in for New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, and other big U.S. cities, or is it a one of a kind and an outlier?
Not at all. I think New York City is in many ways a good case in the sense that New York City is a fairly well-diversified economy. It has tenants from all sorts of industries. As compared to, for example, San Francisco or Seattle, which has a lot of exposure to the technology sector, and we know the technology sector has embraced remote work, more enthusiastically than most other sectors, and it has been hit really hard, much harder than New York City. Los Angeles, for example, is also struggling with very high office vacancy rates. So I think this is a national story. This is an aggregate shock that hits the economy. Some places are doing better than others. Miami is maybe a bright spot in the office market. Yeah. But some of these, these are far and few in between. The markets that are doing well today, the office markets are doing well, are far and few in between.
You've studied the idea of converting unprofitable office buildings into apartment housing, or in climate terms, turning brown commercial property into green residential. From your analysis, I came away with the message that it's feasible, but only for some buildings, certainly not the majority. And even in those cases, it's feasible, but it sure isn't easy. Do I have that about right?
That's true. So there's basically three obstacles here. One is the building physically suitable for conversion, right? And a lot has been written about that. And this has to do with the floor plate. We have a lot of full block, large office buildings, a lot of them glass and steel, built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They're often not amenable to conversion. They're just physically not the right layouts. It's too hard to build apartments into them. The distance from the window to the core of the building is too deep for an apartment layout. There's not enough plumbing. There's not enough air. There's not enough light. So the first step of our analysis was basically, can we filter down from all office buildings a set of properties that are physically suitable for conversion? And we end up with around 10 to 15% of office properties that we think are potentially amenable to conversion based on their physical characteristics. The second step is it allowed by zoning, by zoning and by regulation, right? And that's sort of the place where the government, the local government, can play an important role. And then the third part is it economically, is it financially feasible to convert? And we spend a lot of time thinking about the economics. And as you pointed out, it's oftentimes sort of a knife edge case. What I mean by that is, imagine you can buy this building that was worth $100 million that is now worth, let's call it $39 million. If you can buy that building and its new low value of $39 million, and you put in the extra money to convert it, and you make it a green building, and you turn it into a market rate, let's call it luxury apartment rental building, and you can charge the market rent that is in place today, then it's sort of the economics sort of works, meaning you earn a high enough return as a developer relative to what you should be earning given the risk of that investment, right? So it's feasible, but you start tinkering with the assumptions a little bit, and very quickly, the math may no longer work out.
For the math to work out, does it have to be luxury rentals? Could it possibly be middle income rentals?
So it turns out that, the answer to that is actually sort of, in most cases, again, every building is different, but in most cases, the answer is no. Once you layer on top of it an affordable housing mandate, it very quickly ruins the economics of these conversions. Now, unfortunately, that's what the politicians want. And arguably, that's what we need. We need more affordable housing in our large cities. So, that doesn't mean that it's not possible. It just means that we need more help to make that a reality, right? So we can convert offices to apartment buildings. We can have a fraction of those apartments be affordable, but not without additional help, right? So for example, additional property tax abatements could come into play, additional debt subsidies for affordable housing could come into play, and potentially, given that we're thinking about clean energy, green apartments, potentially federal subsidies through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is sort of the US's climate bill.
But you'd have to have some intervention into the market in order to get that result. That wouldn't actually check it. For somebody who lives in the middle of the country, far from Lower Manhattan, if indeed we see, as Scott Rechler described it, a serious problem with banks and less money for big cities to spend on their neediest populations, how does it affect someone who's living, well, you said Miami is having a good office economy. How does it affect people far afield?
Well, I mean, as we pointed out, I think this is really a national phenomenon. For example, the city of Minneapolis in the Midwest is sort of struggling, has a struggling office market as well. Mm-hmm. Charlotte, you name it. Like, this is an aggregate, this is a national phenomenon. Again, not every city equally, but a lot of downtown office markets are affected, and they're struggling with the same issue. A lot of the implications for regional banks are also widely dispersed. A lot of regional banks tend to lend to regional landlords. And so to the extent that we have these regional downturns in office markets, it will affect the local banks. These banks are not just making commercial real estate loans, they're also making loans to small businesses. So to the extent that they're making losses on their commercial real estate loans, they're going to have to tighten credit to the rest of their borrowers, and that's going to impact the local economies in a lot of different places. So there will be spillovers through credit provision.
Well, Professor Van Neiuwerburgh, stick with us, because in a few minutes we'll be back to discuss this further with you and with Scott Rechler. But we're going to turn now to our third panelist, who is Professor Larry Suskind. Larry Suskind teaches urban planning at MIT. He also founded and is vice chair of an inter-university program on negotiation that involves both MIT and Harvard Law School. Larry has taught about dispute resolution in public policy issues. He's led graduate students to Malaysia to study sustainable city development in 5 Malaysian cities. And he's even taught about socially responsible real estate development. Larry Suskind, welcome to Global Connections.
Thanks, Robert. Good to talk to you.
So let's start with that intriguing phrase, socially responsible real estate development. How would you define that?
Well, if you take what your last two commentators talked about, it's all from the perspective of private capital. Mm-hmm. But if you said, well, you're in public space and you have permission to do what you're doing, which includes some responsibility, not just to make money. And what if we said that responsibility included making the next set of decisions in light of everything you've just heard in a way that doesn't just focus on the return to capital, but also focuses on achieving the responsibilities or social responsibilities of companies that are licensed, that are permitted to build and own facilities. So I think about the responsibilities that go with the opportunities that real estate development is granted through our system of decision-making and regulation. And what if you took all of Stijn's questions and looked at them from the other direction? He was alluding to the fact, well, if there was enough subsidy, federal, state, local, if the building wasn't just going to be residential, it was going to include a whole new mix of things in a new format. And some of them would subsidize others, but you'd have to change all the zoning and you'd have to change all the ways we think about how places are designed and developed. But what if we said the goal is to meet a variety of responsibilities at the same time as trying to figure out how to proceed in a way that the return to capital is adequate? That's what I mean by social responsibility, taking account of all of the impacts of the changes that are occurring and deciding how collaboratively all the interests in the city can work together and how the city government could facilitate a conversation and a set of decisions that would take us to a very different pattern of development, a different system of financing development, and a way of ensuring that social needs were met.
So here we have this fairly common situation around the country now, which is many downtown business districts are facing losses because of higher interest rates and because of new work schedules. That means declines in real estate taxes for localities, as you've said. Has anybody around the country been especially creative in addressing these concerns and breaking a vicious circle in which we can see less money on hand to say aid homeless people, even as we're not addressing the homeless problem?
Well, we have, yes, the answer is yes, and that there's different pieces of that history. If you look in New York and LA, and you look at the idea of public benefit agreements, developer comes in, says, I'm allowed to do this, but I'd like to be able to build higher or denser or whatever. The city says, well, sit and talk with the people the unions that construct housing, sit and talk with neighborhood, talk to the members of the city council that represent the section where you are, and see if you can reach a negotiated agreement. And if you can, then we'll make sure the city allows you to do even more than the minimum that regulations would permit you to do. And the concept of a public benefit agreement, which has been negotiated around all kinds of public facilities. You're going to build the giant sports arena, say to that developer, you got to talk with all of the interests spread out in the area and see if there's a way in which you can reach an agreement on how all kinds of related benefits could be generated for other groups. And if the developer of the facility and the city and the community can reach agreement, we'll let you do more than you would otherwise be able to do, thereby increasing your profit, but ensuring that that extra value is focused on a way that meets the needs of those whose needs are so far unmet by the market. And that idea of negotiated development, we have lots of examples across the country, place by place, moment by moment. I think we need to be thinking about a system that says, whoa, this problem we just heard about today, this is everywhere. There's going to have to be a very different kind of discussion about what the redevelopment is going to be of all of these places that are only half full.
By redevelopment, I mean, the word suggests to my ear at least the possibility of knocking down buildings that have been there for a long time.
That may be the best decision as long as everyone agrees what's going to be built after and how the benefit of the rebuilding is going to be shared. Then people would say, yeah, of course, as long as I get my money back, or the city gets its money, or the developer gets their money, tear it down, build it again. This is a normal process in the history of cities.
Do you agree that the hybrid work week, or I think as Scott Rechler said, that Fridays are virtually lost now to all office work. Do you believe that that is something permanent, and that in fact we've We've turned a major corner as big as it was when we went from a 5.5-day work week. And, people used to work half a day on Saturday. And now we used to think they worked 5 days. Now they work at home for that time. Is it, to your mind, is it conceivably reversible, or is it the new order?
I can't prove it, but in my mind, the addition of flexibility across the board is here to stay.
Yeah.
And you want to attract the employees who you really want and need, and you want to keep them. Flexibility. And flexibility for some means being able to work from home, being able to work different hours, or it might mean being able to come to an office that's structured in a way that's different to meet the needs of a new set of workers. But yes, I don't think we're going back. I don't know what we're heading to, and I don't think we're heading to the same thing everywhere at the same time.
But does structured in a new way mean that's not your office or your desk? You share that with the other guy who comes in for the other half of the week, or the other woman who works Fridays.
That certainly happened in a lot of contexts. And I don't think that's going to go back. Everybody gets their own private office, bigger because you have more status, and somehow the work still gets done. I don't think so.
So I told you, I'm product of an upbringing in a famous, or some would say notorious, housing project that was built with a huge tax abatement for Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, Stuyvesant Town. It was the idea was to have housing for returning veterans from World War II. The city faced a terrible housing shortage, and for all of its peculiar history and unattractive things about it, it was a great place to grow up, and it was affordable, and it was a place for teachers and cops and firefighters, as well as lawyers and a couple of doctors to live in. That was part of urban renewal. They paved over the old gas house district of Lower Manhattan to build this thing. Is there another age of that in our future, of saying, look, we have a real problem with the housing for the so-called missing middle, and we have half full office buildings that are occupying prime real estate? Let's revisit urban renewal. This time, at least we won't be destroying neighborhoods, only office building sites.
I think we have terrible urban renewal stories in different parts of the country, and we have superb urban renewal stories. The critical question is, who's going to participate in making decisions about what happens in each given place? And if you say the goal is just to get the economy back online and get the banks back in to the profit side, you're going to get urban renewal decisions that are going to destroy places, destroy people, but more importantly, miss opportunities that are possible in a new technology age. So we've got to think about who's making the decisions, and could we have collaborative problem-solving conversations that are different in each place, that lead to rebuilding. I don't want to call it renewal, because that evokes all the bad examples of development. But if we could, and maybe it means this is done at small scales for particular buildings, or maybe it's done for neighborhoods, or maybe it's done at multiple scales simultaneously, but systematic engagement of representatives of all the relevant stakeholder groups, I would argue, with the help of professional facilitation. So it's not just the usual political meeting in which people stand up and cheer or boo for one argument or another, but rather collaborative processes that produce collective ideas and shared proposals that everyone says they can live with, because they've all been involved and they've all heard each other, and they've tried to figure out what they can generate by consensus.
Well, we're all going to now hear one another. I'd like to bring back Scott Rechler and Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh to join you, Larry Suskind. And first, I'd just like to ask you, starting with Scott and then Stijn, and then you, just to comment on what you've heard from your fellow panelists, if there's something that you'd like to either underscore, state your agreement with, or your disagreement with. Scott Rechler?
And then just, I thought Professor Suskind's comments about public-private partnerships and collaboration is key. When we think then the point, we've seen some really good ones and we've seen some bad ones. I've been involved in some very good ones. For example, we're master developer of a city outside of Manhattan called New Rochelle, where the leadership of the city decided that they needed to have a redevelopment to spark economic activity, enhance their school district, and public safety and opportunity. But the way that was successful, to Professor Suskind's point, was you had the air game of the leadership, but the ground game of working with the local community to get buy-in to what the ultimate vision was. And then the other piece I think that I've seen successful is it wasn't prescriptive of exactly what was going to happen. It laid out the ground rules of which then the private sector can interact with the public sector, knowing what those ground rules were, knowing what the regulatory process would be, knowing what tax incentives would be available based on what you're contributing on infrastructure, arts, quality of life. And that sparked activity. And, we've seen that in Manhattan also with the East Midtown rezoning as well. So I think that, for the situation where we are right now, where we need such a high level of reimagination of our urban centers, I think we need the leadership to help establish some ground rules, and expedite some of the regulatory challenges. So otherwise, I don't think the private sector is going to be able to effectively participate and produce what is an outcome that's 1 + 1 = 3, and there's a win-win-win situation there.
And Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh, thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
Yeah, I would add one thing, which is that the incentives are aligned. The government, if you like, is a 30% owner of every building in the city, by virtue of collecting property taxes from it. So if it needs to set out, the rules of the game. In the status quo, it's going to face declining tax revenues. If that building continues to be operated as a defunct, half-empty office building, its tax revenues will eventually decline. And so it has incentives to, facilitate this adaptive reuse, these conversions that we spoke about. So I think the conflict of interest in some sense is not there. There is sort of an alignment of incentives just from the tax base. But I do agree that there are a lot of stakeholders in cities that need to be engaged in the process.
Well, now I'm going to, since we heard from Larry before, the two of you, I'd just like to turn to some questions that have been submitted by viewers. One is, this is from Anna Ferretti, who asks, when considering converting office buildings, this is for Professor Van Neiuwerburgh, when considering converting office buildings into apartments, what impact is this upon health and overcrowding? Putting more people in cramped spaces does not sound like a healthy housing solution. What do you think of that?
What's interesting that this comment comes up because I think a lot of our rules and regulations are actually dating back to the period and maybe in the 19-teens and 1920s that there was a lot of overcrowding in cities. And if you look at density in a place like Manhattan, density, the population per square mile, if you like, has been declining ever since 1910. And it's actually much lower now than it used to be in those periods. So I think a lot of those fears are potentially sort of fears from the past. We do have building codes that sort of make provisions on what cannot be done. I do think we have to be imaginative. I think there's a lot, the new generation of 20-some-year-olds doesn't necessarily need to have the same sort of large apartments than its predecessors. I think we can be creative. We can have housing models where we have maybe smaller private bedrooms and more common space, more common kitchens, common dining rooms, and so forth. And I think some of these office floor plates could potentially accommodate that. So I would sort of encourage creative thinking when it comes to housing solutions, but certainly nobody's thinking about overcrowding.
It's a question I'll put first to Larry Suskind, but I'd like to hear from all of you on it. An anonymous attendee asks, for those of us who miss the camaraderie of the office, what is the future of office social interaction? How will this change our overall sense of community in a social sense?
Let me translate that into the university context, right? During the pandemic, nobody was coming into a class, nobody's coming to school, and we still managed to create a community. We have whole years worth of graduates who missed all the classes and all the normal social interaction, especially those who wouldn't have been living on campus. But what we had to do was learn a very different way of creating community online. It was supplemented recently by more face-to-face, but it hasn't eliminated the online development of community through hybrid relationships. So I think that the companies that are trying to worry about the quality of work life need to engage their employees and talk about different, not just one solution, different ways that different subgroups can find the partnership and the companionship and the community that otherwise they would be missing if they're not going into the office every day. But I don't think it's impossible for those places to have different kinds of community generated by the participants, not just from the company headquarters on down, but give resources to the groups, let them figure out how they want to generate relationships amongst them. I don't think it's impossible.
Scott Rechler, thoughts on the new form of office work and the social relations that will follow from it?
Yeah, I would say I do think there is a meaningful dilution of social relationships and personal and professional development if it's fully remote. I think that if you have a hybrid program and if you lead with personal interactions and supplement with flexibility, as Professor Suskind said, I do think that is a part of the norm to be competitive in the future. But it's very, very difficult for most professional roles. Some are not this case, but most of them that are based on interacting with people, looking at people as your mentors, they're your apprentices, you're listening to them on phone calls, you're watching them in meetings, that are much more not designed ahead, but things that happen that you can't plan for, right? Spontaneous interactions. And so I think it's a key, but I also do think when you're in the office, you also need to be much more intentional about not coming to the office and sitting in front of video conference in your own office, or, throughout the day. You need to be forcing these personal interactions, right? And that's something that we do at RXR. We have, when we're here, we have a series of in-person meetings, walk-arounds, events after work, and then on days where we have remote, which is on Friday, we actually have very intense video conference days where we can have 500 people participate in a town hall session, that they can get a better feel for what's going on via a online medium than they would if they were in the office, where we wouldn't be able to see the face and put up slides and have some of those interactions. So again, it's a new world, but I think as technology continues to evolve, we'll find a way to blend that hybrid as effectively as possible.
And Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh, thoughts on social relations and the new style of work?
Yeah, I will give one anecdote, which comes from a major accounting firm as well as from a major financial services firm, which is, when they bring in their new group of first-year interns, fresh out of business school or out of undergraduate, they track their productivity. And what they noticed is that the folks that they hired in 2021 who were remote in that summer internship, performed meaningfully worse in their job sort of a year down the line compared to previous cohorts. And that was just a measurable statistic. And these firms decided to bring those groups back as soon as it was possible for essentially retraining or additional training. And so I think it does show that there is a lot of mentoring, there's a lot of learning by doing happening on the job in person, especially for those first few years of one's career. And I think we need to be mindful of that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that needs to take place in an office. It could take place in a conference room. It could take place on an offsite retreat. There's sort of many real estate solutions to that problem, but I do think the adoption of corporate culture, the mentoring and the training is sort of a critical stage, and it does require in person.
Robert, also, I'll just add to that point, which is, the great resignation was not by accident. I know we were in a tight labor market, but there was also a period of time where there was not a sense of connection. Everyone was a free agent. If you wanted to leave your job, you didn't have to go back into the office to say goodbye to your friends. You didn't have to pack up your desk. You didn't have to change your commute. All you had to do was change your email address, and you sat in the same seat in the same, in front of the same computer. That lack of connection, is part of that the dilution of that social fiber that has kept these organizations together. And I think we've seen through our organization and organizations that I do business with, a much greater decline in these great resignations, since people are back working in the office again, developing personal relationships.
I'll put this question to you, Scott Rechler, maybe our last from the audience. Another anonymous attendee asks, how can a young couple buy their first apartment in this economic environment? And I'll broaden that to, or perhaps house in another city. It's pretty rough.
No, listen, I think one of the great challenges we're going to be facing as a country is our housing shortage. This has gotten, this was challenging, going into COVID. It's been now exacerbated by the increase in interest rates, which not only makes the cost of buying a home or an apartment more expensive because your mortgage payments are higher, but at the same time has created a credit crunch that's now reducing supply. So we're going to come out of this period in 2025, 2026 with a even thinner pipeline of new supply, which is going to make it more challenging. So all these issues that we're talking about, and I think both Stan and Professor Suskind had focused on it, is this requires leadership and intentional policies, because us coming out the other side with a new model, it's not preordained, right? I mean, I always say New York has recovered, it finds a way to recover. It just doesn't happen naturally. It happens with good leadership. It happens with good policies. It happens, with a level of civic commitment and identifying these issues. And we are in a moment where, we have these existential challenges in front of us that, I think the bugle should be blowing to all, leaders, not just the elected, but civic leaders, business leaders, community leaders, that we got to come together and solve these problems.
Robert, could I comment on that?
Yes, please.
Imagine where a city that, because of the decisions it's made, has said, if companies are going to employ new people in these categories, we will help match the company's mortgage subsidy for its new employees. But all of this has to take the form of co-equity, so that when the person leaves the unit that they were able to finance with both public subsidy and corporate subsidy and commercial involvement in this new loan or this purchase, the change in the value of that property over time, that doesn't all go to any one of those contributors. There's a co-equity process, and it certainly doesn't all go to the short-term owner or renter. But it's possible to change the availability of funds to match the policy objective, which is companies want to get new young employees. How are they going to do that? Yeah. Universities got to subsidize the mortgages of new junior faculty because they can't afford to live in many of the cities where the universities are located. And they don't just do that with a bank. They have to put in subsidy. And what if the city was saying, and we want to be part of this too? And what happens is, when there's an increase, because we're all working together in the value of that property, that increase in equity at the point that that owner or renter leaves goes back into the pool. It's possible to have new forms of partnership, not just public-private, but more elaborate. And we could help that person that Anonymous is worried about being able to buy their next place, because it could be part of their work benefit. It could be part of their engagement in that city.
Yes, I was going to say that one of the things driving people to prefer working from home is not driving, is in fact, it's so expensive perhaps to live close to where one works that one has taken on a big commute that can be avoided. But it's even more complicated than that. We live in an era of two worker households, and there may not be any place that's close to both workplaces that the two people have. Let me put a question to you that Alan Birkenwald asks, and I'll ask Professor Neiuwerburgh to answer this one. With declining commercial real estate values, will residential real estate become more valuable?
It's actually a very interesting question, and I think a very difficult question. It is hard for me to imagine a city whose office values are declining precipitously, and that is sort of financially in dire straits, with an environment where residential real estate is flourishing and booming. That is difficult. What I can imagine is that cities like New York City that are fundamentally strong, that still have very strong amenities, that are attracting young people, can sort of turn the ship around through strong leadership, and can turn some of these, offices of which we have too many into apartments of which we have too few, and that can sort of be accretive to the value of the city. I can imagine that. But comes a point where once you're Detroit and the city's spiraling out of control and you're losing population, that the value of the residential real estate will also begin to decline. So it's important that we don't get to that point in sort of our major cities.
I have a question for Scott Rechler. You mentioned that one consequence of all this, as banks write off bad loans to real estate projects that are no longer worth what they used to be worth, we'll lose a lot of banks. That is, we'll have far fewer banks. That's exactly the opposite of the policy aim that we came out of the Great Recession with. That is the feeling that if we have too few banks, we'll have bigger banks, all of which are too big to fail, and we end up, the government ends up backstopping the few banks that survive. Is there any way to avoid our losing hundreds of banks over the next few years?
Yeah, and I think again, I think there's still going to be a lot of banks compared to other parts of the world. And I think Stan, made the point also in his commentary about where we stand right now in terms of the banking situation. I would say that the key to these banks is not so much the too big to fail, is that they are the fabric of those communities, right? They are the lifelines to the small and medium-sized businesses. So it's not just real estate, but that small to medium-sized business, they're not going to JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs for a loan. They're going to XYZ local bank who has a relationship with them, who's helping them fund their business. And so what I think the issue is that we're going to have more of a challenge throughout our country than we did during the great financial crisis, where it was more isolated in the bigger banks. So which I think could be worse of a circumstance in that guys. And just also one last point on Stan's point, you asked a question about New York and other cities. Is it similar to other cities? San Francisco is a tough city right now because San Francisco has the double challenge of people not wanting to work there and people not willing to live there because of the quality of life issues, crime, et cetera. New York, fortunately, has seen an unbelievable uptick of people wanting to live in New York, right? There's people from around the world want to be here. I was talking to a head of real estate of a global tech company who said, we're going to give you flexibility to work anywhere you want to work, but you got to come to work. Tell us where you want to work. And 80% said New York, right? So people want to be in New York. And so we have to reimagine, but that is a natural resource that we have, which is that we have the culture, the diversity, the quality of life, the infrastructure that drives people to want to be here, that we need to lean into.
Scott Rechler, thank you very much. Larry Suskind, last thoughts, if people should come away from this discussion of where we are in real estate right now, what do you think is the most important message they should take?
Don't search for a single solution. The circumstances in communities and cities across the country are really different. And there's not going to be a simple solution to what we do in light of all these changes that have occurred. So let's be focused on conversations that are contextualized, take account of the worst problem or the better problem or the worst opportunity in each place, and don't think there's a simple solution that someone's going to write a book about and say, I've solved the problem of nobody working, everybody working at home. I've solved the problem of empty office buildings. There's not one solution. Right. A lot of hard work to come up with strategies to do better in each place.
And Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh, last thoughts?
Real estate is slow moving. Leases are very long term. Mortgages are very long term, and that creates potentially a slow moving crisis, but it also gives us time to come up with a solution. And I think that I agree that this is going to be a multifaceted problem with that's going to require a range of creative ideas. But I believe there is a possibility to turn this around to the benefit of the cities and to reimagine what cities look like.
And Scott Rechler, I'll give you last thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate again, which is I think this is, and I think Professor Suskind said it well, and Stan said it well, which is this is and also an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity that we have the chance to reimagine ourselves for this post-COVID world. This was accelerating a lot of trends that were already happening in a lot of different parts of the country and the world, and so we should lean into it. We should all display leadership. We should have our eyes wide open to the challenges, but recognize that they're there, and work to find solutions that make us stronger, more equitable on the other side of it.
Well, thanks to all of our guests, Scott Rechler, Stijn Van Neiuwerburgh, and Larry Suskind. Also, many thanks to Joshua Plout and Roni Giuliano of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections. And also thanks to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The group's website, by the way, is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.